So maybe the idea of democracy is part of a kind of response to that time. If you talk about the 富国强兵, you mean they want to get a strong state. That's because they're in a very weak state of China's historical period. So this is their response to the situation, not really their conception of democracy. So if your method, your analysis if you focus more on the historical environment and try to pick out this kind of interaction and get more from, if you consider the situation and take more their opinion from this situation, then you can see what they really think about democracy. So it's, for me, it's very important to emphasize the historical context to understand their conception. So this is my second point. Also, the Taiwanese elite at that time. Also, I think it would be a very helpful situation. And the third is about universalism and the particularism. If you talk about somebody is a universalist, and just like Robert Dahl, then you said for them, I think the democracy has a universal structure. So if you speak about democracy, then you should have to have this and that structure. This is universalist. But you also said that it's not so much universalist if they emphasize something just like you mentioned, not as a universal David Hebb, no. So I'm not sure what does universalist mean. For example, Chengchi also emphasize some tradition. This is a kind of ombudsman system. He said it's from the Chinese traditional ombudsman.
Who mentions it?
孙中山。
孙中山。
对。
孙立宪。
对。And mention is from the Chinese officer or empire's tradition. They have such a officer special for just like the function of ombudsman today. So is here universalist or somehow also use the kind of tradition to support his conception of democracy? I don't know, so I'm not sure what universalists mean or the universalists of democracy mean. So this is my maybe the third response. And the fourth one would be about Jiang Jingguo's idea of democracy. He was a communist and trained Moscow and Zhongshan University. So he was not actually really a conservative. I think a politician. Somehow he was really interested in communist theory and really want to learn from the Politeia, the whole revolution, everything. So I wonder whether this kind of trend also influenced his idea of conception of democracy. So you did not mention that in your paper, so I miss it a little bit. So you can say more about it. I know you are expert of Soviet ideology or politics, so maybe you can say more about that. Okay, maybe at this moment I just raise these four questions.
Okay, but you respond now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. The first about the mobilization. Yeah, I agree. I maybe overstated the point about mobilization. I think my suggestion would be that there are elements in Taiwanese society that reflect or take on some of the aspects, mobilizational aspects of these former models. But there could be some influence from Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, but I don't see them as being the primary influence. I mean, from my understanding, you know, there were the leftists, there was the influence of the people power from the Philippines, there was the influence of the democracy movement in South Korea. I've seen references to the American Civil Rights movement. So I think it's a whole conglomeration of things that inform the mobilizational part of that. But I think that, you know, but because, and this gets sort of, at least to some of the methodological stuff. One of the things the primary things I tried to do in the book, which is a little bit different from what I did here, was to ask, the book initially came out of the question, did the discussions of democracy by the KMT have the potential to have an influence on Taiwan's democratic transition? Because if you look at a lot of the literature, they say, well, one of the influences is probably because the KMT always talked about democracy. So what I said is, okay, let's look at what they said in these speeches for Chiang Kai-shek and Chengchi while they were in Taiwan, and look at the San Minjui lectures, because that's what everybody studies. Kids study them at school, military leaders study them.
Yeah, but they all know there's propaganda and
well, but
they just
the question is
and repeat it because it's political correctness. No?
Right, but my question was, you know, even if it's repeated, could that contribute to democratic learning? Or was there enough substance behind what was being said for people to get an understanding of what democracy is, right? And so that led to my attempt to think about, well, how do we understand what it is that they say about democracy? Can they be fit into these different models, right? And so that's what I did. I looked at the messages and the speeches of Jiang Jingguo and Chiang Kai-shek while they were here in Taiwan, and knowing that they're widely publicized and would provide a context for when people hear the word democracy, that's probably what they would think about, at least initially, even if they would then go on and have a different kind of understanding. And in that context, and we were talking about this on the way over, in the book I do talk about context. And for Sun Yat-sen, I think there is no matter what the context was, or if you want to think about the context being uniform, he always talks about a strong state. He always talks about the necessity of having a strong state. And he does that from the 1890s all the way up to the San Minjui lectures. But what I really do is I use the San Minjui lectures here, because that's what people, again, what they study at school and so forth. But I really don't explore the possibilities of the personal experiences of these people very much in terms of how they talk about democracy, because you could probably do that for Sun Yat-sen. But as we were talking about, when you get to Chiang Kai-shek and even more for Jiang Jingguo, I don't know what was written by those people and what was written by their aides. So what I'm focusing on is the text that came out under their name. And I sort of treat them as a collective entity that I label Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek. As Chiang Kai-shek and Jiang Jingguo. Certainly because I'm pretty sure a lot of the stuff that went out under Jiang Jingguo's name, he did not write.
No.
And we're not entirely sure how much input he had. He probably had, my suspicion is he had some fairly significant input. But, you know, how much, I don't know. I think Chiang Kai-shek probably did a little bit more. But for me, the greater methodological problems would come in saying, let's examine these ideas in the context of the life of Chiang Kai-shek and Chengchi. Because I don't think that I can attribute any particular ideas to that particular person at any particular
But
time.
what I mean is not the personal context, but just like you talk about the consensus. You know, if somebody emphasizes on consensus, that means we don't have consensus. So you know, my emphasis on consensus, that's because it's not. Or if I say you should, because there's no fact like that. You should not lie in this because we lie every day. So you should not. So I mean the analysis, what kind of method we should use. We have to notice the situation, and we should take some part as a kind of only response to some specific situation. But on the other side, you can find that there's a consistency in their thinking. So you find some universal, but some very particular part, because some saying they maybe can be reduced to the situation, to such a the environment or the calculation of the environment or their view of the fact. So if Shen emphasized on 富国强边, that is because in his mind, I think the China will be disappear under the threat of the Western army or military. Just like Japan, you know, the Japan they attack I think the Russia or the China. That's because they are afraid. They have such a calculation. They thought China will be disappear, would be occupied by Western.
I would agree with that, but I think at least in terms of Sun Yat-sen, his understanding of government itself is purely contextual. So for him, democracy is the form of government that corresponds to the modern context. And the modern context is the problems that are internal, the problems that are associated with the modern context are different from all the other contexts which require government. And so the problems of the modern context are the problems that tend towards the disintegration of the state. So for him, you know, that is democracy. Democracy is the modern form of government. If there were to be another different context, democracy would not be relevant. So for him, democracy is purely defined within that particular kind of context. And so when I argue that he's a universalist, what I mean is when he talked about himself as a theorist of democracy, coming up with an understanding of democracy that furthers the conception in a universal sense. So he's not saying and insofar as, well, let me back up a second. He argues that his understanding is informed by the Chinese context. But in many ways what he's implying is that the Chinese context is the epitome of the modern context. And because he experiences it, he is able to gain insights into this peculiarly modern way of governing people, right? And so theoretically, you could take this new, improved understanding of democracy that Sun comes up with and apply it anywhere. It's the new, improved model of democracy, which is especially applicable to China because China epitomizes the problems of the modern context. And so in that sense, it's the Western, particularly American liberal understanding of democracy that's exceptional. that's geographically bound. And that's why it's not applicable to China. But his understanding of democracy would be applicable to the United States should the United States fall apart. Okay, so that's what I mean. But if you were to take him out of that context, he would no longer be supportive of democracy, which I argue is a weakness of his justification. Because if you ever reach the post-democratic context, his justifications wouldn't work. And in fact, he very well probably wouldn't be, if he was consistent, he wouldn't be a Democrat anymore. He would be a post-Democrat. I don't know if that's responsive to your question or not. But yeah, he places himself in a very interesting position. Because he doesn't say, I am a theorist of Chinese democracy.
And that's what you mean, is democracy as kind of instrument called China's modernization.
That's exactly
like that. Yeah.
He has a completely instrumentalist view of democracy. He doesn't have any kind of normative attachment to it per se. It's a purely instrumentalist understanding. And I compare it at least a little bit to Locke's understanding of government. It's a tool. If it doesn't work anymore, you discard it. If you're not in that context anymore, it's not applicable anymore. So in that sense, he's not a pure-blooded, if you wanted to, so to speak, normative Democrat. He's a Democrat by convenience.
But for me, I think that Chiang Kai-shek and Jiang Jingguo have done the same. I mean, in Taiwan, as a minority ruler, with a majority, maybe Taiwanese people. So I think democracy is a kind of a strategy also. You can collect a ballot and also can convince people to obey. I think, so it's kind of understanding that it can be reduced to some situation, some context that it was used to gain, for some gain, political gains in that situation. So I'm a little bit doubt about what are really their understanding or their conception of democracy actually.
Well, but
I mean, if you like comparing with the context and the saying.
If you look at what they say in the speeches, and that's sort of as far as I go, what they say in the speeches is that democracy is natural. That democracy is responsive to something in human nature. Democracy is part of the Tao. Did they mean it? Were they using it instrumentally? Yes. But it's one of these things. I for the first couple of years I went to a Catholic elementary school. You talk about the nuns indoctrinating, right? And my understanding of, at least to a certain extent, of democratic learning is that way. If you're taught that, you're more likely to accept it. And if you have people over and over teaching you, democracy is good, democracy is natural, democracy is part of the Tao, democracy is compatible with Chinese culture, that forms the basis for people thinking about democracy in those terms. And then when people start saying, we want democracy, the government can't very well turn around and say, well, democracy's bad, right? Democracy is un-Chinese. Democracy is not good for you. Because all along they've been saying, in fact, it's compatible with human nature, etc., etc. So, am I under any illusions that Chiang Kai-shek really instituted a democracy here? No. But what I want to do is to examine what he said about democracy to see whether or not there's enough substance there for people to gain a particular idea of democracy that they could then possibly use in the future.
Just a little more. But in the 50s, the Free China magazine, there's some liberalists from China, they really talk about democracy, and I think the Jiang Kai-shek or the Jiang Jingguo, they get afraid because the same terminology, but was used to criticize the government's regime. So, okay, maybe I think if you can get the discourse, of course, when the people know about democracy, it's very important for them to get such a terminology to fight also. But I think the problem, I think that you should, not should, maybe get more discourse in that area. Maybe can.
Yeah, well, yeah. The problem with this is it's limited to these three people.
I see.
It wasn't. What were understandings of democracy at the time of the transition. That would be that would probably be a better book, but it was sort of beyond what the scope of my ambition was at the time.
Maybe just a brief follow-up question, because you mentioned it. Yeah, I was also wondering why exactly these three figures, and I tend to share some of Professor Chen's concerns that you might just be following this discourse there, or reconstructing this discourse, but maybe not taking into account sufficiently social reality, or this gap between kind of some sort of ideological discourse there and then this reality on the ground. So, yeah, well, or maybe you can tell us a few more your observations or your thoughts on this transition area, or how. For example, one point one point which didn't really convince me was your argument about the mobilizational heritage, as you call it, in the sunflower movement. Someone makes this link between this emphasis on mobilization in Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek and Jiang Jingguo, and then this street protests in the sunflower, which we have seen in March and April this year. And you somehow tend to think that the DDP somehow continues this link. This line of thought, while the KMT became much more, how do you say it, more elitist and more conservative. And I don't really, at this point, does not really convince me. I have never really done research on KMT thinking, but maybe you could say a few more words on your understanding of the development of KMT ideology after the 90s. What is now their theoretical or ideological standpoint, if there is one, on democracy in Taiwan, and then maybe you could say a few more words on how exactly you think that there is this link between their heritage KMT discourse on mobilization and the sunflower, because I don't see it in many ways. They seem to be just as they are young people and they are maybe inspired by Egypt. By Egypt, the Facebook revolution, more than by Chinese discourses on democracy. It seems to have happened in a very spontaneous way.
Well, I'm talking more in terms of models of democracy, right? And talking about this particular heritage of ways in which democracy was discussed really from 1949 till 1987.
Yeah.
If you look at a liberal model, there's very little room for mobilization.
Yeah.
That's supposed to take place in terms of civil society, but in terms of competing civil society organizations. Mobilizational models talk about the importance of getting together large groups of people and using their energies to accomplish particular kinds of tasks. And that should be a routine part of governance. Now, the question and the point that you point out and I alluded to at least a little bit was, to what purposes is that mobilization supposed to be used for, and basically who leads it. And for Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, Chengchi doesn't really talk that much about it. Mobilization is something that comes from the top down. And it's used for the purposes of the state, but there's supposedly no distance between the state and the demos itself. In that sense, a Republican unitary model of democracy very easily becomes a mobilizational model. right? Everybody gets together and they work, they make decisions about the state, about policies, and then they engage in the particular tasks that need to be engaged in. Now, and part of the parallel I'm trying to draw is that there is an understanding of mobilization within Taiwan's contemporary democracy. And I think there are multiple places where it comes from. Again, I think it comes from Philippine People's Power movement. We have some fairly direct evidence that the people who were involved in the transition were heavily influenced by the People Power movement. Also, the student demonstrations in South Korea, American Civil Rights Movement, even maybe going all the way back to Paris in 1968. I think that discussions about democracy in Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek is another stream, another possibility where that comes from, which I don't think can be discounted without further work. At the very least, it's there in the past, it's here now. We know that there are other sources, but I'm not convinced that those other sources are the only sources. Now, the other part of it is, and this is where we might get into a little bit of disagreement, I'm not entirely sure how spontaneous, I'm not sure how grassroots these demonstrations are. I went to the demonstrations in Taipei. You know what I saw? I saw lots of green flags. I saw lots of DPP stuff. I saw huge speakers. I saw speaker trucks. I saw large platforms. The students at NCCU weren't paying for that. When I see, free President Chengchi, I'm thinking, where does that come from? Is this a spontaneous kind of thing? No, I think there's an important part of the DPP involved in this. I don't think the Sunflower Movement was a spontaneous movement. I went to the DPP events in the past two elections. I saw their election film video that they showed, which talks about mobilizing the population. It talks about it was entitled "Marching Against the Wind." It's mobilization by political leaders.
You might be right there, because maybe Professor Chengchi, you want to say a few words. I went to these demonstrations too, but I have heard similar comments or interpretations. There are both ways, two ways to interpret these events. But again, I would like to ask why the DDP continues its tradition, if this argument holds true, and why not the KMT? So it's a bit strange, because in Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, they are closely related to China, and the heritage of Chinese culture, which, at least in Taiwan now, as an argument, if you try to convince people and directly refer to traditional Chinese Confucian elements, normally it works against you, because
if you see some green flags, or you see some opposition leader also there, maybe that's because you don't know about I think the Taiwanese local tradition. For example, 黑社岛国青年. This name also is begun in the Japanese ruling time also already, or because the other concept 农民组合呢, this new political I think union, this term is from the Japanese time. This 组合, this union, also 使命 also on the plate. So it's it's something local Taiwanese tradition, and accidentally I think related with Green Party, because part of their political power has such influences from the I think the local elite, Formosan elite from old time. So if you don't mention this, the other kind of tradition not from China, even China is, at that time they cannot really care about China affair. They have to, yeah. So this is the kind of maybe Taiwanese local movement. I think it's really related with the past of Taiwanese history. So that's why it's still like green, but whether or not it's really green, I don't know. Even in the old generation, they came out. Their original language was Japanese, and if you really notice their tongue, you will see some Japanese word, not really Chinese word. They even cannot speak with Mandarin. They speak I think Taiwanese. There's a local language. So this is complicated with such. Also, I think China culture is part of the influences, but not all. Just like you mentioned, that different resources from the past, the history.
Maybe collect a few more questions if there are more questions. Yeah.
So I was just wondering if the contrast that you mentioned from Sun. So. You say that he's looking at democracies in the West and he thinks that there's internal problems because they're liberal democracies. Is that right?
He argues that they aren't sufficiently strong enough. So they're problematic from the Chinese point of view because
They're too atomistic. That's atomistic.
Yeah, the states aren't sufficiently strong because the West has a suspicion of the state.
But externally they're very strong.
Yeah, externally they're strong. Internally they're weak, in his understanding.
Right. So I was just wondering because it seemed to be that you were setting up the contrast between liberal democracy and this other model of democracy that Sun is constructing. And I don't know when the comment, I'm not an expert in Chinese history, so I don't know when he's supposed to have said these things exactly, but
24 and 25, 1924.
Okay, right. So that's sort of what I suspect, right? So if you want to use it as a contrast with liberal democracy, it looks a little bit problematic because the way, it's not it's not obvious that we can say that the West is liberal, or Western countries are liberal democracies at that time. So women are only just gaining rights to vote. They're still discriminated against lots of spheres. Racial minorities are facing lots of discrimination to different degrees of severity across Western countries. So I don't know, I suppose you could say that he's missed. I don't know whether you want to defend the label, say that no, these really were liberal democracies.
Again, he's operating within his times. He's not looking ahead to the 1960s and 1970s and understanding how these will develop. And I also wouldn't necessarily defend him as the most consistent or the best observer of political affairs. His understanding of the West is a bit spotty, if you want to think of it in that way. Would I necessarily agree with his understanding of Western states as being internally weak? No. I can see part of where he's coming from because, he's rejecting checks and balances. He's rejecting, it appears, a very strong constitutional commitment to individual rights. He thinks federalism is something that's purely contextual. It's not something that is necessarily good for anybody outside the United States. He thinks it's something that really originated in the United States. It fits the U.S. context, but not really anywhere else. So he has an understanding of Western liberal states as being weak internally because of the presence of those particular elements. And you can debate whether or not it actually makes them weak. Would the states be stronger without them? Yes. But it also depends on what you mean by weak and what you mean by strong. And again, he's also talking about this in terms of the Chinese context. And basically saying if you take those forms of government and you parachute them down in China, they are going to be too weak. They won't allow you to do whatever it is that you want to do.
If I may add one thing, because you had this discussion earlier already around 1900 with Yang Qichao and the Lian Fu translating John Stuart Mill's On Liberty into Chinese, and then Yang Qichao. And then in particular, Yang Qichao was very concerned about citizenship, about the possibility of citizenship in China. And he saw, the need for citizenship, but he was aware that Chinese agents on the ground did not have much solidarity towards each other, and not many social bonds beyond the family. They're just family and then the state, so no intermediary institutions. And this was one of the reasons for, at least in Yang Qichao understanding, for Chinese weakness. And they all wanted, and at least Yang Qichao wanted to create possibilities for citizenship, and maybe also by emphasizing more and more collectivist kind of notion or collectivist forms of social agency.
And and I think that's what Sun Yat-sen was wanting to do.
Continuing this.
Yeah, he's wanting to expand the state, or at least state-related entities. And I think he saw the party and the state as being sort of interchangeable.
Yeah.
To expand it to that area in which a liberal democracy is occupied by civil society.
Because there was not much.
There wasn't civil society, and he talks about generically uniting, the Chinese through nationalism, right? But what does that mean? It's in some ways it's rather vague, and in other ways it looks like he's talking about using the state to fill that void in various kinds of ways. And so that's exactly what Sun was also talking about. But he's not he's not going to be a Milia kind of liberal and talk about the importance of pluralistic organizations and the individual and so forth. Was that sort of where you're going with that?
So my worry at the beginning was just about the dialectic. It seemed like you wanted to set up a contrast. You wanted to say Sun is rejecting liberal democracy.
Well, he was rejecting liberal democracy on his terms. Do I agree with the terms in which he rejects liberal democracy? Not, but clearly he doesn't want to accept liberal democracy, either in the forms in which it later becomes elaborated upon, and to a certain extent, reading back modern understandings of liberal democracy to his time are anachronistic, but you sort of have to do it. And there are some people who argue, and I sort of agree with them to a certain extent, that this kind of unitary understanding was something that was sort of the flavor of the month, so to speak, in the first quarter of the 20th century. Lots of people were talking about it. And so he wasn't necessarily that far away from what actually people were talking about in the West at the time. And because Held's understanding of elitist democracy importantly comes from figures who are writing early in the 20th century. So he is sort of picking up on things that were being talked about in the West at the time, so he's not necessarily completely out in left field with that kind of stuff.
Yes, to me it sounds quite similar. So you could say that maybe he sees tendencies, or he sees maybe a difference of degree in Western Western culture where there are democracies that are more individualistic. But if you look at what's happening in the West, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the state is being used to socialize people. You have common education systems. You have the First World War. Millions of people dying for the nation. People, seeming to rejoice at the beginning, anyway, at least, in our nation struggling and winning over another nation. So it seems like you have very strong unity. You have this nationalism in Europe, anyway, at the beginning of the 20th century.
And Sun Tzu was writing this after the First World War, right? So it's
Yeah.
defeat and decline of Europe somehow.
Yeah, so maybe then that's more what he's responding to. But so you definitely have that in Western. So say the UK is an easier example. It's democratic, but it also is very nationalistic.
Though to a certain extent, he's extending ideas that he was talking about really for 25 years before. A lot of the
Before
stuff
the war,
he was,
yeah.
before the war, but in the late Qing era. So now again, there was something I was going to say. I probably didn't convey completely what Sun's position was because it's a little complex and it's probably contradictory. This is as clear as I can get it in terms of the nutshell. He argues that the historical experience of the West was such that they wanted to weaken the state because they had bad experiences with a strong state. Referring back to the Middle Ages and so forth. And so he argues there was a reaction against strong states. And so he's not necessarily talking about the West being individualistic versus China being not individualistic. In fact, he talks about, to a certain extent, China is more individualistic, or at least individualistic if you take individuals as families, right? So, or if you want to put it in different terms, it's more fragmented, right? So, in that sense, he argues there's a difference between the Western experience and the Chinese experience. The Western experience stumbled upon such a strong state that the West reacted against it. And consequently might in the future experience problems, but he doesn't really elaborate. What happened in China was there's always been a weak state. And so there's never been a reaction against a strong state. And in fact, there's been institutionalized this fragmentation and weakness. And so what China needs is a strong state to basically bash people's heads together and unify the entire country before it gets devoured by everybody else.
So what does he have in mind exactly by a strong state? Because so to me it seems like the state has been strengthening and strengthening, and I don't know what the idea behind thinking that there was a reaction against the state in Europe at this late period, and then presumably the thought was the state was then weakened. But what kind of weakening of the state took place, or is this maybe he just was mistaken about this?
Well, checks and balances, strong constitutions, individual rights.
Oh, right. So it might not be against the state itself, but the exercise of power.
Well, I think he conflates that with the state.
Okay.
The other point was said something previous to that. In terms of the Chinese experience.
Well, the other comments were just a bit. Yep. So we see nationalism in.
No, right before you I was going to say something that completely slipped my mind about how he understood the Chinese experience in the state.
Segmentation, you mentioned.
You mentioned as well there might be something
about the state itself. He never really elaborates on what he means by the state. He just wants a powerful state.
Okay.
So whenever he talks about it, he starts speaking in terms of metaphors. The state should be like a powerful car, or a powerful locomotive, or a powerful ship's engine. And that's it, right? Now, what does that mean in practice? Who knows? You know, so he never really elaborates more on what he means. He just wants a strong state, and provides these kinds of metaphors as ways of persuading people that they ought to want a strong state too.
I think this emphasis on expertocratic rule is very common between the 1900 and the 20s. I have a German colleague who has written about this.
Yeah.
It's kind of a very common metaphor. The car, more metaphor you just mentioned there.
The car, the locomotive, the ship's engine, the whole.
So they don't really have an understanding of politics as pluralism or kind of.
It's a machine, and it's also, you could argue, it's sort of the political counterpart to the self-strengtheners.
Yeah.
You know, you import a technical understanding from the West, while you retain some sort of cultural autonomy.
Yeah.
You know, so you get this understanding of democracy from the West, because it has the potential to do the same thing that importing technology from the West does.
Yeah.
You know, and you tinker with it, and you improve it, right? And you use it instrumentally in order to do the things that China needs to be done. And then once that's accomplished, then you may or may not be attached to it anymore, right? You know, once the job is done, the tool is no longer useful.
Yeah. Do you want?
No, nothing else to say.
Okay. The audience has left us.
Yeah.
Tell the audience. Yeah. So, if you want to continue over coffee or something, but thank you very much, David. It was a great talk. I'm a little bit embarrassed that we didn't have more listeners.
That's
the audience.
sort of way,
I'm sorry, but it was really interesting, and I hope to continue this discussion. So, maybe we just finish the official part.
Okay.
If you want to get another coffee, we just.